Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for coming. Thanks for coming out today. My name is Mary D'Elia, and I'm from the Albany YMCA. And as most of you already know, together with the Albany Library, we've been doing this Brown Bag Speakers Forum since 2006. Hard to believe, but true. I just wanted to make sure that you know that we will be having a speaker in May and in June. The June date hasn't been quite confirmed yet, but in May, our speaker will be Linda Rugg, who is a member of the Albany Y, but she's also a scholar in Scandinavian studies at UC Berkeley, and she teaches a course in OLLI called, I actually don't know the name of the course, but it's about Scandinavian detective novels. And it's supposed to be really fantastic, off the charts, amazing course. And part of it is because she's probably a very dynamic speaker, but it's also because the culture, so much of the culture is in the detective novel. So she'll be here May 12th. And then in June, we haven't yet confirmed, but are planning to have someone from the Victory Ship, Red Oak Victory Ship, in Richmond, and just telling us the story of, bringing it over from the mothball fleet and over to Richmond, and, the significance of all that and the fundraising that was entailed and that sort of thing. So those two things will be coming up, and then we'll be taking a break in July and August, and we'll be back in September with more fun and games and fabulous speakers. So I'm going to introduce Vivian Jaquette from the Albany Library, who will introduce today's speaker.
Hi everyone, welcome on behalf of the library. Today's speaker has been with Save Mount Diablo for over 25 years. The organization works to preserve Mount Diablo's peaks, surrounding foothills, and watersheds through land acquisition and preservation. In addition to protecting the mountain's natural beauty, biological diversity, and historic and agricultural heritage, Save Mount Diablo enhances the area's quality of life and provides recreational opportunities for all. Please join me in welcoming Seth Adams, Land Conservation Director for Save Mount Diablo.
Thank you all. I'm going to give you a little bit of a history of Mount Diablo. This basically is a history, but the history is a little different in a lot of places where the big theme is how much things have changed. This is more about how little things have changed. And I want you to think about Mount Diablo in a few ways. It's a superlative place, even in a Bay Area filled with superlative places. It's one of the most important wildlife habitats, cultural and natural landmarks in the Bay Area, indeed in California. We often say that we're reassembling a national park-sized wilderness. And Mount Diablo and the complex of parks we work on are bigger than Point Reyes. They're bigger than the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. And they're one of the biggest conservation stories in the Bay Area happening right now. They're also the beginning of a conservation story, which is the next wave for California, where we're used to thinking about redwood preservation, which was one of the early stories, saving the coast, John Muir saving the Sierra and creating national parks, saving deserts. Well, the Intercoast Ranges are the next big conservation story. The ranges that overlook the Central Valley. Mount Diablo is the namesake peak of the Diablo Range, which stretches south 150 miles. So that's kind of a broad view of this work that we're doing. But why is it important to you? Well, it has a big effect. The work we're doing out in Contra Costa and eastern Alameda counties has a big effect on what the East Bay is going to look like in the future. So I'm going to give you a sense of scale. I don't know how big Albany is. I forgot to look, but Emeryville, for example, is about 800 acres. A square mile is 640 acres. So Emeryville is about 1 1/3 square miles.
Albany is
1 square mile. So 640 acres. So I want you to imagine something and try to figure out this for me. What do Concord and San Francisco have in common? And what do California and Japan have in common? Well, we're talking about scale here. So imagine that the city of Concord, the largest city in Contra Costa County, and San Francisco are about the same size in area, 49 square miles. 150 years ago, San Francisco had about 3,000 people, and today it has about 800,000. In 1940, Walnut Creek and Concord together had 4,000 people, and now they have about 200,000. what will Concord and Walnut Creek look like in 150 years? Similarly, Japan and California are about the same size and area. California has about 38 million people. Japan has about 130 million people. What will California look like in 150 years? What we're doing today is really setting the map for what the East Bay will look like in the near future, not just the distant future, but in the near future. So Mount Diablo is a superlative place. We're going to go through its sort of history very fast and get into the history of Save Mount Diablo and the work we've done just in the last 43 years, since 1971. It was an all-volunteer organization until 1988 when I was hired as the first staff person. And so what you're about to hear about is one of the biggest unsung conservation stories happening in the Bay Area right now. There was a light on this thing before. There we go. So just a few historic views of Mount Diablo. As I said, it's a superlative place, really important to the history of the Bay Area, in part because it's a relatively large mountain for the Bay Area with unobstructed views. But it's also the edge of a whole bunch of different provinces, of different climate areas. So we're on the edge of the Bay Area, the edge of the Central Valley, the edge of Northern California, the edge of Central California, at the outer edge of the Bay Area. And at different climatic periods, Mount Diablo has been much more like a desert, like the Mojave or the Great Basin as climate has changed. At other times, it's been like the Pacific Northwest. And as the climate changed again and receded away from the mountain, some of the species that moved down here during different climatic periods stayed, and they even evolved into new species. So again, the Bay Area is a very diverse place naturally, but more than 10% of California's native plants are found just within Mount Diablo State Park, just within about a 20,000 acre area. We could start prehistorically when there was a large inland sea in what we know as the Central Valley now, and Mount Diablo was really just sort of a meandering river valley with a lot of fossil remains getting caught in the eddies of the river, covered with mud, and then exposed later, so that we know that there was a very rich fossil history. It was only in the last 3 or 4 million years that the mountain sort of forced its way up through those sedimentary layers. It's very old rock from out at sea, from a spreading rift zone, that sort of moved inland towards the North American plate from about 3,000 miles away, got to a point where it interrupted some faults, part of the San Andreas system, and those faults keep trying to connect through this harder ocean rock and are pushing it up through those shallow sedimentary layers. So actually the oldest rock on Mount Diablo is at the top, and it gets progressively younger as you move outward. I said it's a place of superlatives. According to Central and Northern California Indians, Mount Diablo is where the world was created. Coyote and his helper Eagle, on 2 islands surrounded by a sea, created the Indian peoples and all that they needed to live. And gradually the waters receded and the world was revealed. Of course, we know what happened to a lot of those Indians. They were affected by European colonization, and they started getting rounded up. In 1797, Mission San Jose was created. The Europeans that came into California talked about what a beautiful park-like place it was. It was pastoral, big open areas under trees. Well, that was because the Native Americans were managing the land. They were burning brush. They were keeping areas open. But as diseases passed through the United States, Indian populations were decimated. And so by the time Europeans actually encountered Indians in a lot of places, 90% of their friends and relatives had already died. Imagine that you're encountering a civilization of people like us where 90% of our friends and family have just died in the previous years. It was a civilization that was in ruins. Mission San Jose was created actually to help convert the East Bay Indians, and by 1800 was grazing cattle and sheep on the slopes of Mount Diablo, 20 miles away. So sheep herding began to affect the mountain beginning in 1800. We all know that lands were handed out to Spanish soldiers and important people, and eventually, as Mexico took over Baja and Alta California, they started parceling out big areas usually the most cultivatable land in huge amounts, 10, 20,000 acres, to citizens who had some level of influence. General Mariano Vallejo was an alcalde of the Bay Area. He had a huge rancho in the North Bay, and he was called by the legislature after California was formed to help with the naming of the new counties. And the East Bay was one county originally, Contra Costa County, but at the time that they were considering names, Mount Diablo County was considered, but it was thought to be too profane. The name of Mount Diablo is actually a linguistic mistake because in about 1806, a group of Chupacan Indians from Mission San Jose decided they didn't like it there very well, and they escaped north back towards their old village. At about the present-day location where Highway 4 and Highway 680 cross at Walnut Creek, this is over by the edge of Concord, there was a big, huge marshy area with a big thicket of willows. And in archaic Spanish, monte could mean woodland, thicket, forest, mountain. It could mean all of those things. And that thicket became known as Monte del Diablo. The Spanish caught up with the Indians, the Spanish soldiers caught up with the Indians about dark, and they decided it would be easier to round them up in the morning. But during the night, the Indians escaped across Carquinez Straits. The Spanish said they could have only done it with the help of the devil, and they named the thicket Monte del Diablo. Well, as big Mexican ranchos were being created, the thicket name got transferred to the big rancho in the present-day area of Concord, and that became Rancho Monte del Diablo, owned by Salvio Pacheco. You can see it there above the A in Contra Costa. As English-speaking people came into the area and they heard about Rancho Monte del Diablo, they thought Monte meant mountain. They transferred it to the most obvious large landmark, and Mount Diablo got its name by mistake. You can see the Mexican ranchos surrounding the mountain. The mountain itself was mostly rugged, uncultivatable land, and so it became pretty much sobrante lands, or common lands that anybody could use. And later some of those common lands were parceled out into new ranchos, which became known as Rancho El Sobrante. But originally the sobrante lands were just common, anyone could use them. And you can see the area here, Las Pasitas down in the Livermore area, Cañada de los Vaqueros where there's a reservoir, Los Maganos and Medanos in the Brentwood and Pittsburgh areas, etc. The first American settler in Contra Costa County, the first doctor in California, at a time when there were 3,000 or 4,000 Californios, Spanish descent people living in California, or Europeans living in California, was a guy named Dr. John Marsh. He was a doctor, a PhD, but didn't have a medical degree, but he practiced medicine. And he pretty quickly realized that he could make more money selling cattle to people headed up to the gold rush than he could being a doctor, but he made a good living. He purchased the 13,000-acre Rancho Los Maganos from Jose Noriega, 13,000 acres for $1,500. And he began his empire. At the time, this is on the edge of Brentwood, at the time, there was pretty much nothing except a few fur trapper posts between him and the Mississippi River. So this is in the 1830s. By 1848 and 49, of course, a big change happened in California. Gold was discovered. And in 1 year, 300,000 people made their way to California. The first overland immigrant party had been in 1841, and people had started trickling in. At the time, most people came in across the Panama Isthmus or around Cape Horn, but beginning in 1841, they started coming across the Sierra. After the gold rush, during the gold rush, after the gold rush, people spread out around California, and a huge agricultural period began. Contra Costa County was one of the largest wheat-producing places in the world, and wheat was shipped out at ports from Martinez to Port Costa to Crockett, and that sort of changed the nature of California. The population, of course, continued to increase, and the vegetation of the place started changing as European grasses started spreading. European and Middle Eastern grasses and plants started spreading throughout the state. when I said that Mount Diablo was the center of the world by Native American standards, that was because it had such a large view. It could be seen from such a large area. For the same reasons, it became the initial survey point when Americans started surveying the area. And so that initial point was extended by surveyors all across northern and central California. It was the initial point in California, and so your property lines are based on it. They might also be based on some boundaries of ranchos, but all property lines in northern and central California, a little bit of Nevada and Oregon, are based on the initial point at Mount Diablo. Colonel Leander Ransom here is the one that began that survey process in 1852. In the early 1860s, the legislature had decided they needed to get a sense of what was available, what the resources were in this new state, especially the mineral resources. And so they commissioned the Whitney Geological Survey, and the survey went up and down the state over the next 3 or 4 years, measuring altitudes, looking at mining resources. But the people who made up the survey were scientists of various kinds, and they did more than just look at minerals. For example, William Brewer, who really was in charge of the survey, because Whitney spent a lot of his time lobbying the legislature for funds, meeting with big donors, things like that. Brewer there, sitting in the chair, was a botanist from Yale, and he collected many of the plants that were known in California for the first time. The members of the survey actually helped found the California Academy of Sciences. They were the premier scientists in early California. Here's a picture of them in what we call present-day Clayton. At the time, it was known as Deadfall. One of the things they were looking at was Mount Diablo for its great view, and they were measuring its height for the first time. They were also looking at some early coal deposits that had been discovered in the area north of the mountain, what became known as the Mount Diablo coal fields. The interesting thing in this image is the wagon there, which looks like a covered wagon, but what it really is a photographic studio where they would develop their glass plates, including images such as the one that you're looking at. The Whitney Geologic Survey thought that Mount Diablo was the key to understanding the state's geology. It had strange volcanic rocks. It looked like a volcano, but it's not. It has volcanic plugs and domes, but it's not a volcano. But they couldn't understand Mount Diablo's geology. It remained a conundrum until the 1960s, when we learned about something very different that they couldn't imagine at the time: tectonic plates, and the idea that big plates of the crust of the earth slide around, collide into each other, subduct underneath each other, and that has a lot to do with the seismicity and with the geology of Mount Diablo. But what they could see was Mount Diablo has a very complicated geology, and complicated rocks break down into complicated soils and support complicated botany. So Mount Diablo has very, very rich botanical diversity. One of the things that Brewer picked up was a little wildflower, which was named by a Harvard botanist, the Eriogonum truncatum, the Mount Diablo buckwheat, a little pink powder puff wildflower. And it was just one of many plants that Brewer discovered. But it would be seen, or at least recorded, maybe because it was so common no one, paid much attention to it. But there would only be 7 historic records made of the Mount Diablo buckwheat, the last one in 1936, and then it would be presumed extinct. No one had seen it since then. The Mount Diablo coal fields north of the mountain became a key to the industrialization of the state. Without concentrated energy, you can't do manufacturing. And the coal mining towns there, 5 coal mining towns south of Pittsburgh and Antioch, became the largest towns in Contra Costa County, a key to the area's diversity. All the different European and other mining laborers who came in through the mines and then spread out through Contra Costa and the rest of California. The discovery of lime in a few places around Mount Diablo was the key to to construction, because without lime you can't make stucco and cement and plaster. And so early cities were all built of wood, and they burned frequently until you could start building things of cement and stone. So these are some of the lime cores on Mount Diablo, which were a key to the employment of of Contra Costa County in the East Bay for a while. What was brand new in the 1870s was a guy named Joseph C.V. Hall. He was actually from New Hampshire, and he had spent time at Gettysburg during the Civil War, as had his wife, Sarah. They came out to California because Joseph Hall had married Sarah. Her family was leading people, early tourists, people who suddenly had leisure time in this prospering country, leading tourists on what was a brand new idea, spending time in the outdoors just for pleasure, not for hunting, not for subsistence, but just for pleasure. And the Crawford Path up up Mount Washington is the first recorded tourist trail in the country. And people would go up to the top. As a boy, Joseph would lead them there. Later, he built the first wagon road up the mountain, including a hotel at the top, but he didn't secure the land rights. And eventually someone else forced him out. He went to the Civil War, ended up in California, where he did the same thing again on Mount Diablo. He and a partner created wagon roads up Pine Canyon and Dan Cook Canyon from Danville and Walnut Creek, halfway up the mountain to what we now know as the Junction, where they built a 16-room hotel, the Mountain House Hotel, and people would come to Mount Diablo and stay for weeks. From the midpoint on the mountain, they would hike up to the top to look at the view through a telescope that Hall had put up there. But once again, Hall hadn't secured the land rights. And the whole idea of open space was changing because people assumed that open space or private land was open to them. But as more and more people started visiting these open areas and creating fires and problems, the people who did own the land started fencing it in. And so eventually ranchers actually burned the Mountain House Hotel to keep people from coming up and disturbing their property rights. That was the beginning of tourism, but environmentalism actually came at about the same time, conservation, but it really got started around the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. And a local resident here who lived in Martinez, a Scotsman, was key in that, as were UC Berkeley and Stanford. Parks for the public are a quintessential American idea, like jazz and baseball. And John Muir helped usher in the first wave of conservation, the preservation of spectacular, often remote places like Yosemite. Yellowstone and Yosemite were the first big parks. But they also lived here in the Bay Area, many of these leaders. And so by the turn of the century, the 19th and 20th century, the Sierra Club was leading local walks in the Bay Area and publishing a schedule. And so there was a move to create open spaces here. The first ones at Big Basin, for example, in Palo Alto. The conservation spread from the Sierra down to the Bay Area. In the 19-teens, after the San Francisco earthquake, a guy named Robert Noble Burgess started really speculating in land. He had made a lot of money in the Claremont area, building houses for people who had moved from San Francisco to the East Bay, thinking it would be safer than San Francisco for earthquakes, especially Protestants. The Catholics stayed around their dioceses in San Francisco. And Burgess eventually put together 60 square miles of land stretching from Concord, including the entire west face of Mount Diablo, all the way to Pleasanton. He extended the toll roads up to the top of Mount Diablo so that autos could go up to the top, figuring that people would buy lots along this scenic parkway in his big development, the Mount Diablo Estates. He proposed a big Moorish hotel at the top called the Torre del Sol. But World War I intervened. He went bankrupt, and the only part of his development that was ever built was the community of Diablo next to Danville. As he was going bankrupt, he started selling off pieces of land. One piece to a guy named Ansel Mills Easton, who created the Black Hawk Ranch, named after another farm he had on the peninsula, named after a racehorse, named after an Indian chief. The interesting thing about Ansel Mills Easton was that he was the namesake uncle of photographer Ansel Adams. But this was the beginning of the Black Hawk Ranch, and that's Southgate Road up there and the entrance to Mount Diablo State Park at the top of Sycamore Canyon. No, that's just grassland. In 1921, Mount Diablo State Park was created legislatively with the idea that they could buy some common lands over time. But again, this whole idea of parks was brand new. It was one of the first 7 state parks in California, had its own state park commission. There wasn't a state park system. Big Basin was the first. Mount Diablo was one of the first 7. It was created legislatively, but it didn't include any land. So there were actually 2 dedications, one in 1921 and another in 1931 after they bought the first square mile of land of what became Mount Diablo State Park. Those first pieces were sold by a business partner of Burgess's named Walter Frick, and Burgess and Frick often got confused until some people started doing research about Frick and found out that he was really the hero in a sense. 2 speculator developers were sort of the heroes in the creation of Mount Diablo because they locked up the entire western face of Mount Diablo for 40 years, keeping it from being broken up and developed the way the lands around it were starting to be. And Frick was popularizing the mountain in part because he thought it would make his other lands more valuable. He even lobbied in Sacramento for a bond that could help buy some of his lands, did all sorts of publicity efforts. He hired a publicist from Berkeley named Wells Drury, whose sons later became heads of the state and national parks, head of the Save the Redwoods League. And he really popularized the mountain. 6 of the first 7 parcels that became Mount Diablo State Park were acquired from Frick. He allowed Chevron, Standard Oil at the time, to put the standard Diablo Tower at the top of the mountain to help guide planes across the country and up and down the coast at a time when there was no radar and planes couldn't fly at night until these beacons were created. And that beacon over time became known as the Eye of Diablo. It could be seen for 200 miles. He also got a letter from a young student at UC Berkeley who was working on her master's, what became her PhD, on the flora of Mount Diablo. At the time, botanical students were assigned a local peak where there were shallow soils and a lot of interesting botany. And Mary Bowerman was assigned Mount Diablo because she was the only graduate student who had a car. And she didn't know anything about Mount Diablo. She was assigned an area that was appropriate to do a flora. She published it in 1936 as her PhD, and in 1944 as a book, as you'll see. But she wrote Frick in Oakland and asked him if she could have permission to visit his lands without paying the tolls on the toll roads, and he gave her that permission. But here you can see in bright green the first Frick parcels which were acquired for the brand new state park. In gray, the whole western face of Mount Diablo that he owned, and in light green, the shape of the state park in 2004 when I made this map. But you can see that Frick owned a really substantial part of Mount Diablo, including the road up through Rock City, which was an area that became well known fast, and 3/4 of the peak. Remember, the peak is divided by survey lines, so it's in 4 quarters, going east, west, and north, south. Here's Mary's book in 1944. It became the Bible of Mount Diablo, and pretty quickly went out of print. Her book and the map there was used for the first map in the brand new state park. There was an observation platform at the top. You can see some metal guides there on the edges of the platform, and on each guide is a name of a landmark in the distance. You look down the guide, and off in the distance you see that landmark, and that lets you know what you're looking at. This was the first state park ranger. Remember, when there wasn't a state park system, that was something that happened in the late 1920s. During World War II and the Depression before that, the mountain changed a lot because Roosevelt employed a lot of people in the Civilian Conservation Corps and the WPA, and they built a lot of the early state park facilities that we're used to, including the Summit Museum at the top of the mountain. The Eye of Diablo, the beacon on the tower, was moved from the tower to the top of the Summit Museum, and was turned on and went around every night until 1941, December 7th, when there was an attack on Hawaii. There was fear of an attack on the West Coast, and the lights were all turned off. That period, the Depression and World War II, ushered in the second wave of conservation in the Bay Area, when private services like private water companies, private firefighting companies, were under pressure from this rapidly growing population, especially in San Francisco and along the Bay Shore, and new government entities were being created to supply things to the people, water, power, etc., to do big projects like build the Bay Bridge. and even to create parks, to provide parks to this rapidly growing population. That was the beginning of the East Bay Regional Park District. And if you have to look at one single thing in the East Bay that's to determine what our quality of life is going to be like, what the map will look like, it's the East Bay Regional Park District system, which is celebrating its 80th anniversary this year. And East Bay Mud had been created to provide a stable source of water. They bought up all these private water companies and the lands they owned on the other side of the Berkeley Hills, for example, where San Pablo Reservoir is. And they decided that they had about 10,000 acres that they didn't need. They declared it surplus. And some of the same citizens who had helped create MUD went to them and said, you should provide land for recreation as well. The East Bay Mud Board of Directors was brand new. They said no, they couldn't handle that. They didn't want to do that. And so the citizens turned around. They did a study by the Olmsted brothers, famous park creators, and they proposed a park system first to the East Bay Mud Board and then to the legislature, and that was the founding of the East Bay Regional Park District in 1934. Well, at the time, their campaign was based on the idea that all of these lands people had hiked on their entire lives were suddenly being fenced by the new water district, weren't available anymore, and they wanted people to have access to those things. They asked Contra Costa if they wanted to be part of the system. Contra Costa had its little square mile park at the top of Mount Diablo. It was an agricultural county, and in their wisdom, the Board of Supervisors there said no, they didn't want to be part of the East Bay Regional Park District. Over time, after World War II, after the Caldecott Tunnel, waves of subdivisions started expanding in Contra Costa County, eating up the agricultural lands and the orchards. And environmentalists out there, community-minded citizens, kept proposing to create a park system there. Here's Briones Park that was being proposed as a county park by who became Senator Nedgedly on the left and the head of the Contra Costa Parks Council, Hewlett Hornbeck, there in the center. And they proposed a park system for Contra Costa County, a county park system, Measure A, including San Pablo Reservoir Park, Point Pinole Park, the Coal Mines Park, and they lost. But the head of the Oakland Park District at that same time, a visionary guy named William Penn Mott, was hired by the East Bay Regional Park District as their new general manager. He was a guy who had an idea a minute, people said. He was hard driving. William Penn Mott, and he later became head of state parks under Governor Reagan and then head of national parks under President Reagan. Well, Mott went to Hewlett Hornbeck, the head of the Parks Council, and said, how about we just do a measure to expand the East Bay Regional Park District into Contra Costa? They figured out where they could get the best votes, so they left out the far eastern parts of the county. In 1964, they were successful in expanding East Bay Regional Park District into Contra Costa County. The first new park was Briones Regional Preserve. And Hewlett Hornbeck was then hired to become the first acquisition chief of the expanded park district. And he went on in his career to create 40 regional parks and protect 49,000 acres of land in this rapidly expanding park district. Here he is in the 1960s. He was a Martinez resident, like John Muir, like me. Martinez is a place that breeds conservationists, evidently. And I had a huge effect on the park district. Well, that brings us to 1971. By then, subdivisions were starting to creep up onto the slopes of Mount Diablo. Mary Bowerman, by this time, was in her 60s, and she had continued to explore the mountain and look at its botany. She was always concentrated on the peaks of Mount Diablo, the area she was assigned as a student when she didn't know anything about it. And she was a member of all the local environmental groups, the Contra Costa Park Council, the Native Plant Society, the Mount Diablo Regional Group of the Sierra Club, and she would go to these groups and say, what are we going to do about Mount Diablo? It was getting increasingly threatened. Even in the 40s, she was talking to landowners and saying, what are your plans for your land? As the state park was slowly growing. By the time of 1971, it had grown to just 10 square miles. You had to drive halfway up the mountain to get into the park, and all of the areas that we now think of as parkland were still in private hands. Well, the head of the Mount Diablo Regional Group of the Sierra Club was a nuts and bolts, no-nonsense Midwesterner named Art Bonwell, and finally he said, let's create a group just to work on Mount Diablo. They invited representatives of every group they could find, and on December 7th, 1971, Save Mount Diablo had its first meeting, and they all collected 25 cents from each participant to send out the minutes of the organization. You can see what the 70s were like with silk screen printing, etc. And at the time, there are the 10 square miles of Mount Diablo State Park. There were 2 other public lands of some size in the area. The boundary of this map is Highway 680 on the west, the Delta and the Central Valley on the east, and you can see Highway 580 at the south. So the parks were Mount Diablo State Park, where the 2 peaks are. That same year, Little Contra Loma was created up next to Antioch around a reservoir, and out in the Central Valley edge, you can see Clifton Court and the part of the State Water Project, some public lands out there. Everything else was private. These were the 3 parks in 1971, the 10 square mile state park, Contra Loma. And there was a public land, a large public land that was nearby, 13,000 acres, but it was completely closed off behind barbed wire fences, the Concord Naval Weapons Station. We're going to start moving very fast now because we're going to look at just some key acquisitions over the last 43 years and then some concepts. So what does Save Mount Diablo do? Well, we acquire land and add it to the various parks around Mount Diablo. When we started, there was just 1 park. Today, there are 50 parks and preserves on and around Mount Diablo. And here's our Vieira North Peak property, for example, 165 acres. Focus on this because 95% of it burned in last September's Morgan fire. We respond to development threats. That's the unusual thing about us. We really started as an advocacy organization and began acquisition 5 years in. While we own the land, we restore it. We clean it up, restore it, bring in species that are no longer found there, build trails, all the things that you can do as a landowner. And then we transfer it to a public agency for long-term management. And that's so all of us can enjoy the mountain and all the different recreational pursuits we have, which are really the way we involve people, both through cleanup and restoration activities and through taking them out on the mountain in various ways. So I'm going to show you a chronology of important places that we've protected over these last 43 years. You don't have to focus on anything except they're beautiful, and the theme of them is parks. Usually try to acquire the next piece next to a park agencies. Save Mount Diablo tries to think about how we want things to look at the end of the process, and so we can make more visionary leaps than most park agencies can. So in 1976, the first acquisitions at Black Diamond Mines, a park to the north of Mount Diablo in the historic Mount Diablo coal fields. Shell Ridge and Indian Valley were a touch point in the Save Mount Diablo movement. The Walnut Creek City Council approved cutting the ridge off to the left to fill in the valley in the center, and the citizens of Walnut Creek stopped them and created the Walnut Creek Open Space System. The northern canyons on Mount Diablo, Mitchell Canyon, Back Canyon, Donner Canyon, really amazing wildflower spots, especially right now. But usually they're the best wildflower spots on Mount Diablo. They're eclipsed this year by the Morgan Fire area. The Walnut Creek Open Space included Shell Ridge, it included Lime Ridge here between Walnut Creek and Concord, and increasingly parks were being created around the mountain. Over the next 35 or 40 years, 6 or 7 regional parks would be created around the mountain, and now another 7 are being created as we speak. There was a little 14-acre area around John Marsh's house out by Brentwood, which is now a 4,000-acre new state park that's not open to the public yet, called Marsh Creek State Park. 5 years in 1976, Save Mount Diablo thought we would have more credibility if we raised money to acquire land too, and we bought our first piece at the corner of Marsh Creek and Morgan Territory Roads. Well, at the time, North Peak there was in between this property and the state park boundary on the other side of North Peak. So it was kind of a visionary move that we assumed the state park was going to expand out 4 miles to reach this property that the little volunteer organization was acquiring. And they were right. In the next decade, some major acquisitions were made. North Peak, the second largest peak on Mount Diablo, the top of it was acquired in 1980. This is the view from the Mitchell Canyon area, and that is snow. Our first big development fight was the Blackhawk fight. Remember Ansel Mills Easton's property? Over time, it was enlarged to 6,500 acres. And at one of our first meetings, this Florida developer came and offered 100 acres of the 6,500 acre ranch to Mount Diablo State Park, and we said no. And over time, 5/6 of the 6,500 acres would be protected, 2/3 of it for addition to Mount Diablo State Park. Places like stretching from Alamo out to Finley Road and the edge of Dublin Livermore, including Black Hawk Ridge here, Devil's Slide, Wall Point, Oyster Point, a whole set of dark-colored ridges known as the Black Hills, some of the most spectacular lands on Mount Diablo. Pine Ridge would be pieced together from Shell Ridge to Diablo Foothills Regional Park to Mount Diablo State Park, starting with those Black Hawk dedications. In the 1980s, my friend Bob Walker, who introduced me to the new organization when they were thinking about hiring their first staff person, started working on his favorite place, Morgan Territory Regional Preserve. At the time, there were 5 miles of land between Morgan Territory Regional Preserve, a little 700-acre preserve, and Mount Diablo State Park in the distance. And he helped lead the fight as a member of a whole bunch of environmental groups to connect the two parks across that 5 miles. And from 1986 to about 2004, he was successful in preserving 3,300-acre Riggs Canyon and connecting the two parks. He helped lead the Sierra Club as its president at the time, the Bay chapter of the Sierra Club, and helped create a whole set of other regional parks like Round Valley here, also next to Brentwood, the most beautiful valley in the East Bay. After a state bond was very successful, it had provided somewhere between $5 and $20 million for the East Bay. It was a statewide bond, which requires a majority vote. Well, local bonds, most of them require a 2/3 vote. And CalPA, or Prop 70, as it was known, passed with a high enough percentage in the East Bay that we turned around 6 months later and did a local bond called Measure AA for $776 million, which created a whole vast expansion of the East Bay Regional Park District system of almost 30,000 acres from 1988 to the present. And a whole series of regional parks were created, many were expanded, and Morgan Territory and Mount Diablo State Park were connected. The Contra Costa Water District was proposing its own reservoir. It gets its water out of the Delta, and it wanted a more secure supply. So they began a process to create the Los Vaqueros Reservoir. But even though they were building a 1,600-acre reservoir, they bought a 20,000-acre watershed as big as Mount Diablo State Park, with Morgan Territory connecting between them. So a lot of what we're talking about here are big parks and small parks being created and then connected in an overall complex of Mount Diablo parks. We began our first efforts to connect from Mount Diablo to the coal mines, the Mount Diablo coal fields, with this property. We were already stretching towards Brentwood, from Walnut Creek to Brentwood with Round Valley and Morgan Territory, but we were also stretching parks down to Livermore. So you can literally begin a hike at Walnut Creek and hike all the way to Brentwood or Livermore. Brushy Peak was one of those preserves just north of Livermore. The grasslands out on the edge of the Central Valley included Vasco Caves here, a really important Indian cultural site as well as a hot spot for endangered species. Here's Clayton Ranch, part of the Black Diamond Mount Diablo corridor. More pieces at Black Hawk. The dedications came in over 20 years. The last piece in Riggs Canyon. And that brings us to 2000 when things start speeding up again. Turtle Rock Ranch, which was a picnic facility in the middle of the park, an in-holding. 4,000-acre Marsh Creek State Park out at the edge of Brentwood. Here's our Mangini Ranch property. And it was interesting because it was important to Mary Bowerman, our co-founder, because it had really interesting botany. And right above the Mangini Ranch was one of the historic sites. She was the last person to see the Mount Diablo buckwheat, which Brewer had found. David Gowan here was looking for it on a trip that we organized. And he looked across to Lime Ridge and thought, wow, this habitat is similar. We didn't find it in the historic site, but he looked across the watershed to Lime Ridge, said, wow, that looks like a similar exposure, a similar habitat. Maybe it's over there. He went there, and literally 3 miles from downtown Walnut Creek, didn't see the Mount Diablo buckwheat, but discovered 2 brand new plants unknown to science. What became known as Gowan's Navarretia, he didn't name it, and the other plant that he discovered he named for Mary's collaborator in updating her 1944 book, Erder's Eriastrum. we used those little plants to stop some communication towers at the top of Lime Ridge, which is a theme that you'll find with Save Mount Diablo. We're always looking for ways to publicize the mountain and to have an effect on development project. Mary's book was updated in 2002. And afterwards, Barbara Erder, her collaborator, realized that we had preserved land so fast that there were big areas not covered by the book. And so she started assigning them to graduate students, including Michael Park here. After his 70th trip to Mount Diablo, he was wandering around in an area he'd been before when he saw a little flower that he had never seen before. It hadn't been seen for 70 years, since Mary Bowerman last saw it, the Mount Diablo buckwheat, which was rediscovered in 2005. But the ivory-billed woodpecker had just been supposedly rediscovered and announced in the news a few weeks earlier. So the news of the Mount Diablo buckwheat went around the world in 12 hours. His parents in LA saw it in a Korean language newspaper. It's in Jane Goodall's book about rediscovered species. Unfortunately, by this time, Mary Bowerman wasn't in very good health. At age 97, she'd had a fall. She was in a home. But I had the pleasure of taking her a picture of the Mount Diablo buckwheat, which no one had seen alive, and no one had ever seen in its true state. They'd only seen dried specimens from the recorded stuff. No photographs existed. And I showed it to her, and she wasn't that impressed. And we realized Mary was the only one living who had actually seen the Mount Diablo buckwheat. So it was interesting to her. But what was more interesting was, who found it? Was it Barbara? No, it was a graduate student, and that made her very happy. Mary Bowerman died a little later that year, in 2005. This are the two co-founders of Mount Diablo, Mary Bowerman and Art Bonwell. We found 15 plants in this one site, the only recorded site for the Mount Diablo buckwheat. We collected 200 seeds, propagated them at the Botanical Gardens at UC Berkeley, created 40,000 seeds in the first generation, 200,000 seeds in the second generation, and a lot of those seeds are in seed banks, and the Mount Diablo buckwheat moved away from the brink of extinction. These are Mount Diablo buckwheats there. So why do we care about all these endangered species? Well, everybody knows they're canaries in a coal mine, and if we can protect the land that's necessary for endangered species, we can protect a lot of other things as well. But it's not just that it's an overblown story. We really do live in a hot spot for rare species. This is a Nature Conservancy map of concentrations of rare species in the United States. The number one spot is Hawaii. California is number two. And if you look at California, the far East Bay, partly because of the Delta, is a real hot spot for numbers of rare species. We have dozens and dozens of rare plant species, even hundreds. But we have quite a few listed endangered species as well as other categories of rarity. It really is a hot spot, but it's also a place with a lot of development pressure, and that's a train wreck waiting to happen. One of the things the Endangered Species Act allows is for the creation of overall plans for preserving species to be paid for by development. It's kind of a double-edged sword, but it brings everybody to the table, and you come up with what's called a habitat conservation plan. And it's meant to augment an existing preserve system to expand it and make sure these species not only are protected, but are enhanced. And right as Measure AA was running out, the East Bay Regional Park District bond, we passed this HCP in 2007. It needed matching funds, and so in 2008 we extended Measure AA as Measure W, and we were successful in both efforts, and that began another huge expansion of preserved lands around Mount Diablo. In the last 6 years since the HCP was created, we've protected more than 15,000 acres around Mount Diablo. That's 22 square miles. So why do we want to connect and expand all these preserves? Well, for Mary's purpose, for botany, a small area can preserve a plant, but wildlife moves around. And so especially in the time of climate change, when habitat is changing, here are sort of the lessons of conservation biology. A larger park is better than a smaller one. If you have two parks, they're better if they're connected. Two parks covered with chaparral, one burns in a fire. If it's connected to another one, species can recolonize across the wildlife corridor. Without it, they may never make it back to the burned habitat. The more edge there is, the more impacts there can be from things on the edge. Most fires start in subdivisions, for example, by people and move into park areas. So the less edge, the better. And overall, if you have a choice, it's better to have fewer larger parks than small ones. And so the whole idea of an HCP is, rather than just having every developer preserving a little bit of land here and there for endangered species, as they're required to by the law, it's better to have an overall system. So as I said, in 2008, we extended Measure AA. That means there's another 30 or 40,000 acres that's going to be acquired over the next 20, 25 years around Mount Diablo. The whole East Bay Regional Park District system, which is now at 112,000 acres, is going to continue to expand. And a lot of those areas are in the HCP area to the east of Mount Diablo, the grasslands. And a lot of people see grasslands and they wonder, why do we care? They're centrally beautiful, especially in the spring, but why do we care? Well, a lot of the things that live on Mount Diablo, especially birds, hunting birds. Did you know that the Altamont area is the largest concentration of golden eagles in the world? Well, a lot of these birds that nest in the rocky peak areas of Mount Diablo do their hunting in the grasslands off to the east. So without the bread baskets, you can't support all the species that are found at Mount Diablo. And of course, a lot of species, the bigger predators, which we're lucky to have in an urban area, need huge areas. So unless we can keep Mount Diablo connected to the rest of the Diablo Range south of Altamont Pass, we'll lose the mountain lions and the bobcats. The coyotes will probably do fine. So just since 2000, here are a few of the legislative efforts we've been involved in. We acquire land, we respond to development proposals, we work on policy issues, such as the Concord Naval Weapons Station. It was declared surplus, and these are a few examples of recent big projects. The map on the left, we prepared at the beginning of the process for planning the reuse of the Concord Naval Weapons Station. $200,000, and 2 years later, the map on the right was adopted by the Concord City Council, including a new regional park bigger than Angel Island, bigger than Tilden, between Concord and Pittsburgh. That'll be the Concord Hills Regional Park. And you can see the big wildlife corridors along the edge of the development along Mount Diablo Creek there. This is the kind of work that Save Mount Diablo does. When Los Vaqueros was proposed for expansion, it's an off-stream reservoir. They pump water into it from the delta. When they proposed to expand it, including flooding some lands that they had promised to protect, we argued for a very high mitigation burden. So they destroyed another 650 acres, but they acquired 6,000 as mitigation, endangered species mitigation, and we helped direct where those would be, including the last connection in a 70-mile donut of open space stretching east of Mount Diablo, and the first connections underneath Altamont Pass, two cattle tunnels underneath Highway 580, which will continue as wildlife corridors and maybe even as recreational corridors as we head down into the rest of the Diablo Range. In the area between Mount Diablo, Black Diamond Mines, and the Concord Naval Weapons Station, we're working on another corridor. Gloria Thomas here, her family's been there since the mining days. She was our poster child to help stop a Pittsburgh proposal to stretch up Kirker Pass Road next to Black Diamond Mines. We saved that property in the late 1990s, and then we were able to come back 3 or 4 years ago and acquire the remnants of the Thomas Ranch where Gloria was born, to help foil a bad developer and to help create that corridor that I was talking about. You can see the corridor between Mount Diablo State Park and Black Diamond Mines. The numbers are chronologically which parcels were acquired. When you see two numbers, that sort of indicates that we acquired the property and then we transferred it to an agency. And you can see 14 or 15 acquisitions stretching between Mount Diablo and Black Diamond Mines. We've literally doubled the size of Black Diamond Mines in the last 5 years to 10,000 acres, and we're one parcel away from connecting Black Diamond Mines to the new Concord Naval Weapons Station Regional Park. All those cross-hatchings mean that land is not open to the public yet, and literally 30 or 40,000 acres are not yet open to the public and will be opened gradually over the next series of decades. This is what the land looks like. This is the Irish Canyon area, which we acquired first and then transferred to East Bay Regional Park District. This is our current biggest acquisition, most expensive ever, 1,100 acres surrounded on 3 sides by Mount Diablo State Park, called Curry Canyon Ranch. And $7.2 million collected from people like you. It includes the largest rock outcroppings and cliffs left in the East Bay. when California condors, we've already reintroduced peregrine falcons to Mount Diablo, but when California condors come back, this is where they'll go to nest. They're currently in Pinnacles National Park, but the cliffs at Mount Diablo are very similar. So, what's it all mean? This is where Save Mount Diablo was, 10 square miles when we started in 1971. Remember Clifton Court Forbay and Contra Loma up there? There's the Mount Diablo baseline and meridians, the survey lines extended. You can see the county line down here, Highway 580 below it. Here's 1986, 15 years later. And in 2001. And in 2013. So we are literally reassembling a national park-sized wilderness. We've gone from 10 square miles, 6,800 acres, to 110,000 acres on and around Mount Diablo in 43 years. But you can see that it's like a puzzle. And we've completely surrounded the Marsh Creek Morgan Territory area there in the center, but that's 30,000 acres that we hope to protect most of. We've almost surrounded the Tassajara area south of the mountain in Morgan Territory, and we're increasingly encircling other areas. So this is literally a work in progress, and most of our funds come from individuals like you. The last two stories I'm going to just tell you is, remember the Mount Diablo beacon that became the Eye of Diablo and then was transferred to the Summit building? Well, in 1964, Admiral Nimitz proposed lighting the beacon, which had been turned off since Pearl Harbor Day, as a memorial to Pearl Harbor survivors. And it was lit every year on December 7th. It just happened to be Save Mount Diablo's anniversary. A few years ago, they were told that the Pearl Harbor survivors were told they could no longer do their event without insurance, and we stepped in and said they could use ours. And so we started co-sponsoring the event. And then a few years in, the beacon was kept spinning one night a year, literally with baling wire and Scotch tape by our volunteers. So last year we proposed to restore it, and we were successful in that restoration effort. And in December we had put the beacon back on top of the mountain, and we lit it again for the first time since it had been restored after 80 years of use.
How often is it lit?
Every December 7th.
Just once a year?
Just once a year. But it now looks like brand new. It was restored to historical standards. It's beautiful. Before we were able to put it back on the mountain, however, something happened, which was on September 8th last year, a big fire started at the northeast corner of Mount Diablo. It became known as the Morgan Fire, and over the next 4 days, it burned 3,100 acres, literally 5 square miles of land, the east and south faces of North Peak and the main peak. And at one point they said that they were protecting the Mount Diablo beacon, but it was actually being restored in a warehouse, so they were really protecting the Summit Museum up at the top. But there were literally flames at the peak of Mount Diablo, and on the Summit Road became sort of the fire break for the firefighters. So if you want to see the Morgan Fire and the wildflowers that are there now, because Mount Diablo is adapted to fire and most of what burned was chaparral, this is the best wildflower year I've ever seen. This is what our VR North Peak property looked before the fire and afterwards. Looks desolate, doesn't it? All of the grassland areas look like they never burned, except there are black strips, black sticks sticking out of them, and huge poppy fields. But the chaparral areas like this, which look like gray ash, sometimes they're black sticks. In some areas it burned so hot that it literally incinerated everything. But there's a whole host of plants that only show up after fires. Some of them haven't been seen since the big fire in '77. Some haven't been seen since 1931. But a lot of the plants, especially the chaparral plants, are basil sprouting. And this is a great year for wildflowers on Mount Diablo everywhere. The best year I've seen because the grasses are short from the dry air. But I've never seen globe lilies this thick. Whoops. And these are literally hundreds of thousands or millions of Fremont star lilies from a picture I took last week. If you want to see the wildflowers on Mount Diablo, drive up halfway to the top to where the Summit Road, where the two roads join together. Drive up the Summit Road, look to the right, and the best place to see them right now is the Green Ranch Fire Road, the Green Ranch Road above the Oak Knoll picnic area. What does this all have to do with you? Well, Save Mount Diablo collects money from individuals. A surprising amount of money. You would think most money would come from rich people. It doesn't. Most money for this kind of conservation comes from the middle class, and generally in the form of estate planning. You put us in your will, or some portion of your estate to us, and we use it to acquire lands like this to reassemble this national park-sized wilderness. Probably the most important wildlife area in the East Bay, if not in the Bay Area. Thank you. Now, was that a rapid-fire style presentation? I can answer questions if anybody has any. I know that was a long show. An hour-long show is something to sit through, but I hope I made it interesting.
I have a question. Who owns the land that you want to acquire, that middle part ranch? Who would you get that land from?
A lot of private landowners, especially a lot of ranching families. Ironically, the poorer families who went through the mining area bought the most rugged lands, which tend to be the least good for agriculture. A lot of them became cattle ranchers, and a lot of them are now land-rich, cash-poor. So a lot of the land we acquire is from old ranching families who came through the mines. But the lands have also been parceled out and subdivided. We've helped almost stop that subdivision process in the inner areas of Mount Diablo, and we're literally reassembling this landscape.
What are, can you name some of the wildflowers that have come back now, that are there?
Well, it turns out a lot of these areas that look like impenetrable chamise and chaparral. Chaparral on Mount Diablo is dominated by one species called chamise, but it changes in different areas. And you imagine that 99% of that habitat is chamise. There are millions of bulb plants sort of hanging out below the chamise, not doing much until there's a fire, and suddenly they get a surge of nutrients, and they put out big, huge flowers. So the bulb plants are the first ones to flower. But in the seed bank, there are what are called fire follower annuals, plants that only germinate after fires, sometimes from light, sometimes from heat, and especially because of the chemicals found in smoke. Those things trigger these seeds, and there are literally millions of annuals that are, last week they were just starting to bolt to flower. And if the temperatures don't get too hot, they may be incredible. Regardless, they're found in such large numbers that they'll be amazing no matter what. But how long they'll last, literally in the next 1 to 7 weeks, is going to be based on how hot it gets, and different pockets with different exposures will do better. Literally, if you look at the picnic areas along the Summit Road, there's nice stuff happening around them, so you don't even have to walk. But if you take the Green Ranch Fire Road, the Oak Knoll Trail, you'll see amazing stuff. Other questions?
How difficult is the Oak Knoll Trail?
The Oak Knoll Trail is a little single track trail. It's not that hard, but the Green Ranch Fire Road is a fire road, and for the first mile or so, it doesn't have much up and down. If you go 500 feet, you'll see amazing stuff. But you can also just go along the Summit Road without hiking at all and see amazing stuff developing.
How much of what you showed us is available online?
Online? Almost none of it. That's me putting this together for you for this purpose.
Thank you.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Do you have to always purchase the land? How often does it get donated?
Land preservation philanthropically happens generally where people have lived someplace for a long time and have developed wealth. The people who owned land in the Mount Diablo area were poor. Philanthropy really started with the community of Diablo and then La Marinda, etc. A surprising amount of our funding comes from Berkeley, Oakland, etc. And literally most people think it's rich people who do most of the giving. The middle class is the predominant source of philanthropy in America, and especially, as I said, through estate planning. We get most of our money in small donations and in bequests and things like that. But our business model is we raise the money to acquire a piece of land, and we help an agency raise the money to acquire it from us so we can use our money again for the next piece. And I'm working on 5 pieces right now.
Are there different fees to get in different parks?
Absolutely. There's kind of both a sort of diversification of having many different parks around Mount Diablo, city open spaces, watersheds, state parks, even some national park areas. And they all have different regulations and things like that. But that's allowed us to do well when, for example, state parks was literally broken and had no money at all. We've got 10 pieces waiting to transfer to the state parks that they won't even accept right now. So having all these different parks meant that we had regional parking money or some other kind of money when state parks were broke, or vice versa. They all have different regulations, and during the budget problems with state parks, they jacked up fees. So it's actually more expensive to go to Mount Diablo State Park right now than a national park, but hopefully that'll get back in balance. And regardless, you're doing good work every time you pay a state park entrance fee.
Are the campgrounds open?
They are open, but we're in a dry year here, and most of the faucets on the mountain are turned off. So if you go, take your own water.
But the campgrounds are open,
The
just...
campgrounds are open, the showers are turned off.
All right, who needs one?
Isn't it gonna rain this week?
I hear it's going to rain a little bit on Tuesday, but starting Wednesday, I'm leading a 4-day trip that we do. It's a cushy backpacking trip called 4 Days Diablo, where we hike from Walnut Creek to Brentwood without ever leaving public land. And we've made the connections that we can actually do 7 days Diablo once the trails are open in the loop that we've made back to the north. So literally, from Mount Diablo, we have a 70-mile in circumference donut of public lands, so that you can get off BART, walk a mile, and begin a 7-day backpacking trip. Isn't that amazing?
Thank you so much.